Welcome to Unlearning Economics, everybody. So I have with me Dr. Deema Awad and Dr. Miriam Tresh, and we are going to discuss decolonizing universities. So thank you for coming, both of you.
Thank you for having us.
So we both worked at the Psychological and Behavioral Science Department, LSE, and you two, I noticed, have been working on decolonizing the department for a few years. And dare I say, you've been trying to decolonize the university itself a little bit. How's it going?
Right, decolonized.
Oh, that's it. Well, that's great. We can finish there.
End of episode.
Yeah.
Done. It's going quite well, actually. I think this year in particular, we made really good headway in the small step that we wanted to achieve. So that's not decolonizing the department or decolonizing the university, but it's a step in acknowledging that is a path that we need to take. So we've been working this year on developing a course around centering marginalized voices in psychological and behavioral sciences. So we're ready to go for the next academic year on developing a course. You know, we've worked with colleagues at the department to kind of get that off the ground. So that's been like amazing work in the last year, considering I think we stalled for a while in the conversations on how do you do it. And I think that's like one of the biggest roadblocks. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, of where that kind of stop and start comes from. But yeah, this year has been a really good to be able to collectively as a department agree that something like a course that centers historically marginalized voices in our discipline and kind of getting to that has been really great.
Deema, do you share Miriam's optimism?
I do. So I'm focusing more on it in terms of research. I guess we'll get more into the details of the research itself, but I am working on kind of either you can call it decolonizing the research or diversifying the research methods that we use in psychology and making it slightly less Western centered. So my area of research is social cognition broadly, which is about, as the name implies, it's about applying cognitive psychology principles to social psychology. So how do we perceive different people? How do we, who do we pay attention to? What kind of emotions do we look at? Does it change based on ethnicity, on age and gender, et cetera? So this is, it's not, and I mainly work on like face perception stuff, which is not a new field, really. It's been around since at least the 70s, really. But it's been predominantly really Western centered, where it's either studying Western faces, young as well, and also by Western European participants as well. So this year I am working really on the first time on a project that will have representation of the global population, that we can study everyone rather than a specific subset of human population. And I think, I'm guessing we'll talk about it more in details as we go on, but it's surprising that this field is not new at all. And it took us until now to think like, hold on, there are more people to study than this subset and what that means for psychology in general.
Yeah, we'll definitely discuss this because I was quite struck by the paper you sent me on facial recognition. So I do want to go into the details of that later. I mean, the thread between what both of you were saying seemed to me to be this first step, right? Because, when we joked that decolonization was finished, right? Miriam, you were sort of saying, well, we've got this course on centering marginalized voices. And then Deema, you were basically saying something similar for research, right? And I think this first step is literally just like what you said, bringing the rest of the world in. because there's this like weird critique of psychology that's underpinning this, right? And that's been around for a while. The Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic participants and researchers and topics, everything is colored by that. So, I mean, I guess the thing is that kind of predates decolonization, right? That weird critique. Do you see them as they're clearly linked? Do you see them as the same? Because it came from quite a while ago, and yet it still hasn't been addressed. Or do you see them as distinct?
So maybe I'll talk about the weird problem a little bit. You're right. It's not new. The weird bias, essentially, it started as a critique of the participant samples of psychology experiments, where they're usually college students to begin with, but also Western students, and obviously that can't translate to the whole population. But that's kind of the first critique, or the famous critique of it came in 2010, really. Unfortunately, it hasn't changed. Even I think in 2020, the original authors of the paper said again that the needle hasn't really moved since then, that researchers are still not not recruiting a more diverse sample of participants. And there are reasons for that. I guess it is easier to recruit college Western students, but also they're also not acknowledging this issue and not acknowledging how this issue relates to the, how can we generalize the findings of this problem. But when we talk about the weird problem, we usually focus on the participants only, which is the, let's say, the more commonly known problem. But there are other issues. We have a weird problem, as you say, with researchers that come with Western approaches. So I am Palestinian. I'm not a Western, as you can hear in my accent, I'm not a Western academic, but even I am trained in UK. Okay, so even I come with theories and with my teaching or my learning is, let's say, Western specific as well. So you have the problem with the researchers themselves, but also you have the weird theory, so how we think about the individual and the universalism as well. You also have weird methodology, as I said, so like the problem of applying Western specific methods to research somewhere else is also problematic. And eventually you have the fourth problem, which is the weird institutions, which comes in terms of, universities, funders, journals, editors in journals, all of those that are also Western, educated, etc., etc. So you're totally right. It hasn't changed since 2010. Even at the most simple one is the participants one, and even that hasn't changed. But yeah, maybe Miriam will speak more about the decolonization.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't necessarily say that decolonizing and the weird problem are the same, but I also wouldn't say they're distinct. I think the weird problem forms a component of this idea of decolonizing, right? I think decolonizing is a much bigger idea to grapple with. I actually think that's what sometimes puts people off or kind of moves people away from it. Something like tackling the weird problem in psychology, if you're thinking about participants, there are tangible things relatively that you could do to kind of address those. And I agree, the needle hasn't moved very far at all, but it seems a lot more tangible to be able to kind of address that as an issue versus this idea that our discipline, psychology and the wider social sciences are inherently colonial in their kind of the way they operate today. And we have to move away from that. I think decolonizing is really about acknowledging that psychology, social sciences stem from or are grounded in those kind of colonial ideas. And okay, we might argue that colonialism as a movement is physically not here, if we're thinking about just colonialism, not other forms of colonialism, but that in particular. But I think the consequences of it are what appear in our discipline. And I think that's the much bigger problem. And yes, the weird problem might form a part of that, but it's the idea that, you know, we have this very Euro-American centric psychology, and that dominates how we think about knowledge. It dominates who gets to decide what's important to be looking at. It, you know, decides how universities operate. It decides what policy to focus on. It decides all of these things. And I think that's a much bigger issue that we're thinking about. So I think, yeah, the weird problem being a component of decolonizing, I would argue.
I mean, it's interesting because decolonization is clearly a much bigger idea, and it's also a much more challenging idea. So, I mean, you already saw we're not recording this live anymore, but some of the comments that were on like the stream before it went up, like people are like, "Oh, it's wokeness," you know what I mean? And I just whereas weird, I feel like people are more likely to accept the weird critique, right? Because I think everybody can understand that having a bunch of like middle class white college students as your experimental participants isn't generalizable, right? It's fairly straightforwardly bad science because it just doesn't apply to like most of the population, right? People can accept that. I've seen Ben Shapiro, I don't know how familiar you two are with Ben Shapiro, but anyway, I've seen him say that, right? So whereas I think decolonization, it prompts these much more radical discussions, right? And that's probably maybe why people are more resistant to that than the weird critique.
It's also quite a discomforting conversation to have for people. That's definitely something that I think we both recognized. You can have, I think, a more removed conversation about the weird issue. You're right, it's not any one person or one group of people's issue. And, you know, think we can tackle this. We just need to get greater representation in our participants, in our researchers. Oh, we can do that. That's quite a tangible thing to do. But I think the conversation around decolonizing can make people feel uncomfortable because it raises questions about which groups of people have a greater sense of privilege and where do they have power, where do they have power to define what knowledge is, to be able to produce that knowledge. And so it comes with a sense of kind of a personal like reckoning of like where you sit within that like hierarchy of power and knowledge. And people can, I think, understandably get quite uncomfortable by that. And it's about trying to I guess, in a sense, separate it and not make it about individuals, right? But say, actually, this is about systems and structures that some groups of people are benefiting from more than others, right? And how do we actually create a greater sense of equity for people in those structures?
I think you're slightly more have a better view on this or more optimistic.
Oh, I don't know if I'm optimistic. I think
because my experience with it, that actually people are discomforted to speak about the weird issue to begin with, because they at least the people in the field seem to kind of get defensive about it, as if you are, you know, criticizing them specifically. And also I feel like there's an issue of either, even when we try to push it slightly, you know, beyond the limits, the Western is still as the default, and then you choose another minority as, you know, the other group, basically, and then that's it, and you can't go beyond that. So you can't do more than one minority or anything. Like, of course, some do, but usually it is, you know, the Western versus
you have like the Western as your like your anchor or your reference point, right? And everything is in every group, or set of individuals is in reference to
but even in terms of the literature and in terms of the theories and the knowledge and all of that, even so I was speaking to a social psychologist from Palestine, and I asked her, because she had a critique about, you know, social psychology in terms of just talking about Palestine and talking about just different aspects of who we are as a society. And I asked her, so what do you teach in your courses? And she said, I still teach the mainstream social psychology stuff. And I'm like, okay, but how does that relate to the everyday life, differences between where this knowledge came from and where you are teaching it? Because there are differences. You can't bring a happiness scale and try to apply it somewhere completely different in a different context, ignoring the context. So there is an issue about also we as non-Western academics also decolonizing our own theory and our own teaching as well, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah, I think there's definitely this I don't know if you'd call it hypocrisy, but there is definitely this tension and difficulty where I think a lot of people pay lip service to this type of stuff, but when push comes to shove, I mean, I've done like online experiments, and then you use one of these platforms like Prolific or Amazon, MTurk, just because it's what's available to you, right? And it's like relatively affordable, relatively accessible. It's accepted as a valid sample, and then you use that, and it's like, well, that's a very weird sample in itself, right? So you just end up falling back on these things, and it happens in teaching as well.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. It is, I mean, I've done it myself as well, in lab experiments as well. It is harder to, recruit more diverse group of participants, not even just in terms of race and ethnicity. Let's say LSE is a very international university. You'll find people from different nationalities, but also in terms of like age group. That also is a big differentiator here. But that is when the whole, publish or perish kind of thing comes to play, where you're like, okay, are we pushed to produce more just in quantity, or are we looking for quality? Obviously, it's way harder for junior academics to do that because we are judged on, what we produce. And obviously doing an online study is way easier than trying to recruit different participants. But that's the balance that we have to play with, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a don't hate the player, hate the game aspect to it, right? Which I suppose is why like initiatives like the one the two of you are spearheading are quite important, because you need to get the institution to acknowledge that there's a problem and start to like provide resources and direction on how to properly change things, rather than relying on researchers to take what is actually quite a tricky path that's not gonna get them a publication, yeah.
Yeah, no, it needs to be at an institution level. Otherwise, you can't change it on your own. And that's why some grants are kind of like directed towards, highlighting underrepresented groups, et cetera, for different reasons. But it also falls on everyone has to play their role, I think. It's, if it takes you slightly longer, it has to be done, I think, because otherwise we're just going in circles, and we're just reproducing the same knowledge that applies for the same people again and again and again. And that is problematic of its own, because even when we try to expand from that, let's say, okay, I'm gonna take whatever knowledge I got from here and I'm going to use it in an intervention somewhere, in the global south or something like that. But I haven't studied it on people from there. I haven't investigated whether these methods are appropriate. And I just said, okay, yeah, you've had a crisis. Here is an intervention that is gonna work on your cognitive abilities. You're wasting resources there. It does become like a lip service where, okay, yeah, we're giving them an intervention without actually studying anything about how effective it is. So it's not just problematic in terms of fundamental research and theory and doing good science, but also it's about all of the how we apply this science and like any policies to do with this science. All of this becomes flawed and becomes non-impactful research. You know how we researchers like to have impactful research. So it just becomes just a circle of talking, really, rather than doing anything that actually does help communities.
Miriam, let me ask you a little bit about your teaching, because this speaks to these specific challenges of really designing something that changes how we do things. So how have you approached this in your teaching?
In my teaching, I think I laugh with the students this year that every year my lectures become a little bit more radical on this topic. Every year I ask the slightly more radical questions of this. And I think that comes from me learning more about this. Like I came to the questions around decolonizing fairly recently. I think psychology as a discipline came to the ideas of thinking about decolonizing fairly recently. We're much further behind than like social sciences like sociology, for example, or anthropology. They're much further ahead than us. And I think that interest in bringing that into my teaching came, from kind of research interests and kind of personal interests and stuff. But so within my teaching, I've tried to bring it into asking more, I mean, I guess to a degree, asking more radical questions, but actually asking more radical questions about the basics of who is asking these questions, who is producing the knowledge, right? Who are the knowers, right? The people who we are leading on, right? And typically they are, the white canons, right? Who are they? Why is it them who are determining kind of topics of interest? So I deliver it in a the first lecture the first year undergraduates get. So I start from the very beginning, and they have like a history of psychology lecture that I give them. So it's 2 hours where I basically tell them, that the mainstream story of the history of psychology. So it's all, you can trace it all the way back to philosophy with the ancient Greeks, but, it really was kind of early 20th century when it took off as like a science, right? Where we'd say, okay, we've got the scientific method in psychology. We're kind of situating ourselves between a social science and a natural science. And I think that confusion of sitting between those plays into the challenges of decolonizing psychology, I think. So I present them that story, and then I literally at the same time say, well, this is, a very specific, very neat, tidy European story about psychology, right? But actually, if you dig into it a little bit more, some of those really kind of fundamental ideas that kind of founded psychology were being talked about in other places much earlier, right? You think about something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That was being talked about by Arab scholars, for example, at the same time. And again, not to say, oh, they were the first people to come up with it, but of like which knowledge are we amplifying and which knowledge are we putting into the story. There's a very strong European American story around psychology. And so I try to bring it in by saying that's a really great story, and we shouldn't be disregarding the white canon in that story, but actually we should be creating space. And so I kind of open it up to the students of, what else is going on? And actually it's a real advantage to have such a diverse student body, because actually you can say to them, like, what knowledge on these topics is coming from your people, right? What do you know about psychology from your cultures? And that's I think a really nice way to start it off, and then I kind of carry that stream through until they get to third year, and then third year I kind of do a really, again, slightly more radical, who's asking these questions, who's determining policy interests that academics are feeding into, and that I really frame around this idea of kind of this Western export, right? That actually what we're exporting is a very Western style of thinking about psychology and behavioral science, right? And we're taking that to the global south, and we're giving them these methodologies and we're giving them these ideas, but actually, are they always appropriate? Are they always suitable? And that's the kind of discussion I bring in as well. So that's kind of how I'm doing it in the teaching at the moment. matter.
So I'm
I think
wondering.
it's also important to say that, like, I don't think we're claiming that, like, every single psychological phenomenon varies as a function of race or where you come from, or that, like, every single psychological publication needs to be highlighted, highlights the role of race or in the topic that it's dealing with. I think what we're saying is that racialized experiences, they do shape how people think, how people develop, how people behave, how they make decisions, et cetera, et cetera. We know, like, our department is really into how context matters at different levels of psychology. So I think that is the claim that we are making here, not that it matters for every single phenomena, but rather that if we don't dedicate any attention to this, then it's a disservice to our students, but also it's a disservice to the field itself, that this needs to be taken into consideration. And as Miriam highlighted in the beginning, this is not new, right? We are not pioneers really in this topic. So sociologists have been doing it, anthropologists have been doing it, other psychologists have been doing it. So it's not a very, very, new to the field either. So just to make clear, we're not saying everything is racialized, but it is something that needs to be looked into.
So, I mean, I was wondering, while both of you are talking, do you have like I'm sure you've got many, but do you have like a cool example for listeners of a sort of psychological theory or idea that seemed to really work in a Western context, even a measurement or something really simple, that when you take it somewhere else, you're like, oh, this doesn't apply at all?
Well, I can tell you from a personal experience, I did... I worked with a project that looked into a humanitarian crisis, and it looked into trauma and how that influences affective development and emotional recognition and different cognitive abilities after going through trauma with children and with mothers as well. And one of the measures that we were using was called a trauma questionnaire. Okay, so these are questions that are really hard-hitting, really. And they're like questions such as, have you seen someone being killed? Have someone in your family died like that? Has really traumatic questions. And so I would be asking the participants these questions in their homes. So they weren't coming to the labs. We were visiting home by home. I'm sitting with a mother or with a child, and I'm asking these questions in Arabic, really difficult questions. But these questionnaires, to me, did not recognize the part of the community that kind of believes that kind of everything happens for a reason sometimes. And sometimes that you should say, Alhamdulillah, or thank God for anything. So kind of that doesn't take that into account, but it also doesn't take into account that we are in people's houses. So you can't really kind of take one questionnaire from one community and apply it to another. So that is one thing that I dealt with. But really the examples go even from back in the day, they used to have experiments on like 1 participant or 5 participants. I am originally trained as a vision scientist. And you would have papers with like 4 participants in it, which like 3 of them are the authors of the papers. And the idea there is that, well, these are biological processes that shouldn't matter from one person to another. And that is not true. And that is what actually the original weird bias paper says, that actually when you compare these participants versus other more global population, you see that there actually are outliers from the basic perception studies that are apparently are perceptual only, which are not, to the more high level social stuff. So you will find differences in these from all over psychology domains, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I always in because I come more from the economics side of things. Um, and there are so many examples in economics as well. I mean, we've got like the sort of fundamental unit of mainstream economics is like the profit maximizing firm, that only really pursues profits. But I think when you go to businesses in a lot of countries in West Africa, for instance, that's just not what the companies are doing. They're not profit maximizing. They're family companies, and they don't they seek to employ the family and keep the family going. The same in India and in a lot of countries that are not industrialized, right? It's a completely different model of the firm. So yeah, I do think these examples are absolutely everywhere. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is something that sort of came up. I feel like I thought of it, but I might have just read something and then convinced myself that I thought of it. But the replication crisis, right? We've had the replication crisis, and we've got the weird critique and the related challenge of decolonization. I mean, do you see a link between the replication crisis and decolonization?
Absolutely. I again, much like I think when I like conceptualizing that idea of the weird problem being a part of decolonizing, the replication crisis definitely fits within that. I do a lecture with my third year students, and we talk about like randomized control trials, for example, right, as this kind of gold standard research methodology, right? You run these trials, and you've got your control condition and your experiment condition, and you can say something, you can make some inference about causality on behavior, right? And we know, I think even, from an economics perspective, from a psychology perspective, that these are kind of presented as this gold standard of being able to measure, right, and look for causation in kind of influencing behavior. And then this kind of replication came, and that very much fits with kind of the experimental methodology that like Deema and I come from in psychology, right? It's all about experiments. You take it to the lab and you test it in a very highly controlled experiment, and you can say something about causality. And then we find out that actually a lot of these things don't stand up to replication. But actually what we've been pushing is this very dominant methodology, right? We're calling it a gold standard. We're saying this is the best way to do rigorous scientific psychology research. And that's what we've exported to the global south, for example. And we said, okay, if you want to understand what's causing this behavior, what's the kind of causal relationship here, you need to be running experiment levels, right? You need high level of control of your variables, and you can say something about causal relationship. So that kind of then crisis to realize that actually a lot of these effects that we were teaching, right, and we were saying, it was just this is how it is. I think if you think of things like priming, for example, it turns out there are really small effect sizes that just don't replicate. How much do we use? We used to talk about priming, we still do. I think the first line of my PhD thesis is like references a study that just doesn't stand up to replication, right? But we're exporting that. And so I think in that sense it does fit within this broader decolonial idea, because we are emphasizing, or we're allowing this methodology to be the dominant methodology in our field at the expense of actually other methodologies from elsewhere. And we're saying, but they're not as robust, right? They're not scientifically robust like our methodology is. But also the studies using this methodology don't always replicate. So I do think it does have that relationship.
I think one of the things that we really work with our students is just to develop like a skill of critical thinking, basically. It's the idea that they can, they don't take whatever knowledge they are reading in a paper for granted, okay? That they have to think whether, okay, what is the question here? Is the methodology that I'm using really answers the question that I am answering? Is the conclusion here really, can I generalize it to everyone? So I think the days of students just reading any paper and taking anything at face value, I don't think that is what we are working with anymore. We are not just trying to work with students to just kind of say the same content again and again, but to actually to analyze it and to reflect on it more and more. But actually, in terms of the replication crisis, that was really, I think, like it hit us mostly strongly at like 2011. So actually, it overshadowed the weird bias issue, basically. So we got like, yeah, we got really let's just say we ignored the weird issue because there was a lot of emphasis on the replication crisis, and that took a lot of the work, basically.
And it ended up sort of focusing more on the technical side of the replication crisis, right? Like sample sizes, pre-registration, and so on, which is good in itself, of course. But I think there's this broader issue that you were both speaking to, which is just, you know, questions of different types of evidence that you can bring to bear on a problem. I mean, I remember there was one paper, and I forget who it's by, but they evaluated an RCT, an economics one, that was like some kind of development intervention, some kind of class, you know, these RCTs that economists do, maybe a year of schooling or something. And it had been evaluated from a quantitative perspective, and they'd found that it had worked, but she went in and did it from a qualitative perspective as well. And the picture was much more complicated. People didn't really seem to think it had worked. And the thing is, if you look at like the sampling, like 50% of the sample dropped out of the quantitative evaluation. So it's like, then she spoke to like some people who dropped out, and you just get a completely different picture. And I just like, you can't, I mean, even if we accept for the sake of argument that RCTs in theory are the gold standard, in practice, they're really not right. And you're going to get different answers if you use different methods.
Yeah, I mean, that also relates to the bigger question of who is also running these experiments. So like, even if you have experiments in the global south, they are usually maybe decided on by, researchers, like maybe from here or from the States or from whenever, but they're mostly run by field workers or by research assistants in the specific countries. And there's usually a power imbalance between, the field workers and the, principal investigators. Well, actually, you would find that in most of these cases, the field workers actually know their context much more than, and the day-to-day life, way more than the researcher on it. And this is where, I had a similar study where I'm a quantitative by training, but I did a qualitative study where I spoke with the field workers about their perspective on it. And they say that, they didn't find that methodology fits, and if it's on, they found that they felt like they were using the people as data as well, especially when you are dealing with issues with mental health, where you are like kind of asking them really traumatic questions, and then you're like, okay, we're done. Thank you, we're leaving. So this type of thing, I think, so like even, I mean, obviously I'm not talking about any individual specifically, but I do think that like, even when we do think about, okay, we're gonna include participants that are not, European and stuff like that, we still need to think about it a bit slightly deeper, to think about the context that we're doing it, who is running it, what do they think as well, and how are we running it. I think that's the participants question of its own, or the sample of its own. I think that is the shallowest of the problems.
Yeah.
And that's why it needs change at institutional level or at a department level, where you train people to think of this on a regular basis.
It always amazes me when you get these researchers sort of descending on, a village, a quite poor village halfway across the world, and giving half of the village a goat, and then being like, studying the results, and the whole thing costs like millions and millions of dollars, and it gets them loads of grant funding and a publication and stuff, and somehow researchers, in particular economists, don't see the obvious colonial echoes of such a practice.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, you know, so for example, like the World Bank were doing a lot of kind of randomized controlled trial work in Africa, and like the response to that as well, you know, and the justification of like, again, theoretically, this is that gold standard, right? They're not too expensive in comparison to other methodologies to do. There's not that much resistance. So it was literally, you know, parachute in, conduct some randomized control trials on these communities. But actually the issues of like kind of echoing that really kind of colonial ideas, right, of upholding the structures that existed there around poverty and inequality, being really exploitative. So I think Deema's point to kind of who are the researchers on the ground, and kind of that kind of exploitation of local labor, of being really extractionist of knowledge, like mining knowledge from these people, using them as resources, and then going out again and being able to say something about, well, we can improve the World Bank policy making because we've done some randomized control trials in Africa. Yes, we've exploited the kind of population. We've completely ignored any sort of sociocultural, social political context within any of this. But you know, we've done what is gold standard research here. And that, yeah, it's yeah, as you said, that kind of very colonial.
It is a very colonial relationship. And it's also, you know, to the point of the knowledge creation, it doesn't seem to me that you're going to create reliable knowledge by doing that, right? So for you to then say, oh, it's going to improve the World Bank policy, I mean, you as in them, not you two, but like, yeah, to say it's going to improve the policy so it's justified, is like, well, it's not if your RCTs are a load of crap because you haven't considered local conditions, other methodologies, power relationships, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I just do want to emphasize that I think for junior academics, as we've said before, we are really in like this imbalance of trying to, you know, you want your project to be kind of like perfect and answer all of these questions and be conscious of the context and all of that. But yeah, there is also the other pressure of like, well, you have to produce, or you have to get these statistically significant, or you have to, even at the reviewing stage, you have to say the right words, or you have to, you know, I just want to like, I don't want the listeners to get the impression that, you know, this is what needs to be done and people are just choosing not to do that. Right. It's just a harder way to do that. And for that, it needs a systematic change rather than an individualistic change.
I also think, no, I agree. It's not to say that there are these solutions and people just aren't doing it. I don't think that that's the case at all. I actually think a lot of the challenge comes from as well in our disciplines, like, you know, in psychology, for example. I think there is this, you know, like push and pull between the need for trying to determine what are the kind of benchmarks, normative benchmarks for what is rigorous science, right? What can we try and agree as a discipline, what is the benchmark for rigorous science, but actually without being too narrow-minded or minimalistic of other methodologies, right? And I think maybe that's where the challenge is for disciplines like psychology, like economics, that maybe the reason, and you know, I'm not a sociologist, and so I'm only kind of, I've done shallow reading in the field, but maybe, you know, not being bound by that kind of more natural science idea of kind of the scientific method allows for kind of a broadening of being able to think about other methodologies, thinking about, you know, the range of epistemologies that can lead in, that can be drawn upon. And we're kind of in this push-pull idea of like, we need rigorous scientific methodology so we can have these kind of benchmarks or these kind of standardization in a sense, but also trying to create room to say that actually there are other methodologies that could be really useful and really insightful for us. And we're kind of, I don't know, I guess kind of battling with those. And that's the conversations I've had with people, you know, in the department who really are for like, we need to determine what is rigorous science. If we want psychology to be seen as a science, we've got to have a benchmark for what is considered science in that sense, but also creating space to acknowledge that there is such diversity and nuance in the human experience, we also need to capture that in psychology and in economics as well.
Well, maybe I'll speak about my research here because it's a bit of, I think it showcases that, because I'm not even critiquing the field to change the methodology here. So I do face perception, right? Face perception is a fundamental, really cornerstone of like social and cognitive psychology. It influences our daily social interactions. It influences developmental, political, behavioral, all kind of psychological levels. Subconsciously and consciously, in the way we vote, in the way we hire, in the way we choose mating, etc., etc. So even here, my critique of the field is that I'm not saying change the methodology, okay? I'm not saying, so face perception, you usually ask participants to make different judgments on the faces that they see. And we try to see how that influences their behavior and influences their decision-making. For example, I am saying, can we study a wider range of faces? Okay, so here it doesn't require much work from them. So let's say a facial perception scientist, what they would have is they would have a database that has different faces, okay, that they can study in terms of different facial judgments. Either the human faces usually they use, or they use computer-generated faces. I'm not talking about AI stuff, but more old-fashioned faces. Yeah. And they're over and over, they just use Caucasian faces. And the idea here that we know in the field that there are other race effects. We know that people have different facial recognitions of people of different races. We know that they look at faces from different races differently. They grab attention differently. We look at them longer or less. Some races look at the inner face. Some races look at the outer of the face. Some races, we look at the emotions differently, and not to say that this is due to racism. There's different hypotheses why to do with our expertise of different faces or how much we interact with different faces. But the field does know that there is other race effect. So they are aware of that because of different studies, yet we keep again and again and again just studying the same faces, the same databases of European people, especially young people as well. And these, as I said in the beginning, these findings are then taken and applied in facial recognition technology. They're applied in forensic science. They're applied in policing, stopping and searching people. They're applied in mental health interventions. So here, what I am proposing is that let's have, it seems really simple to say, let's just have a database that has loads of people from different races, different ages, so that when we are studying these things, you can apply it to everyone, not just to a specific group of people. And because of that, also, you have even loads of studies. So I did a meta-analysis on it. You have loads of studies that they would have participants that are not Caucasian, but when they come to the analysis part, they drop them because they're like, oh, we're going to drop them because we don't other race biases to confound the results. Well, what is the point there then? So again, just to go back to Miriam's point here, even when it comes to changing methodology, we're not even changing methodology. The methodology is still the same, but we're just trying to expand the stimuli that we use in this methodology. And this field is older than me, right? I'm not very young, but it is older than me, and we're still using the same stimuli. And that I think sometimes comes from, from people's different perspectives and how, if you are not from different groups, I think it just doesn't come up.
Of what people think is a priority in the field, right? So I think you and I have had this conversation a lot, right? Well, we don't feel represented in that research. And so for us, that's a priority to kind of get that representation. We're actually maybe for other people think, okay, the field has issues and that what you're talking about is not the priority for us at the moment.
Yeah, and it's obviously easier for a researcher to use a database that exists already rather than having a project that just built this database. But this project is so small compared to the millions of dollars kind of resources that we have in this field. So I blame, but also I don't blame at the same time. I think there's a balance there.
No, I mean, it's an absolutely perfect example, your research, Deema, for everything we've been talking about, right? So like face research, obviously, clearly the faces you see directly related to ethnicity and race. And, as you detail in the review you did, like both the participants and also the faces that are shown still are, well, white, right? And they have been for a long time, and it hasn't really changed. And there's also these issues of differences in how different cultures interpret faces and how they look at faces. So I think it covers like most of what we've talked about, right? That exact example is just like there are all these problems with just restricting it to white faces and only looking at them in a certain way and only having white participants. It's quite incredible, really.
Because it is incredible, because when you first think about it, you're like, well, face perception, like we all see faces, right? But actually there are little biases that that influences behavior. It does influences, for example, in healthcare, okay, how doctors read the emotions of patients from different groups. It does affect even, for example, like psychopathy, right? Like we have now interventions that kind of try not to go into too much into it, but there's this hypothesis that psychopaths can't read fear on others, right? So fear is one of the innate facial expressions that we all recognize. So there's this hypothesis that one of the issues with psychopaths is that they can't read fear in others. So one of the interventions they have is that they teach them how to read fear by using these faces again. It's just like these teaching programs, but it's using white faces again. Wow. So it's just kind of, even though with that we know that there are emotion recognition differences based on race and age as well. So that's when it becomes like you got there, but not really. So it seems minimal, but actually when you see where it's applied, it becomes an issue, really. And because at some point then you're just wasting resources if you don't pay attention to these things.
Yeah, I mean, another example, which is maybe a little bit less serious, but I mean, I remember when the iPhone facial recognition first came out and it just didn't work for non-white people. So it thought East Asian people were the same person when they weren't, and it also just didn't work for like black people, as far as I remember. So it's just like, it apart from representation in itself, it has consequences, right? Things don't work if you only train them on weird populations.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I mean, so this question of methods, I want to, because we were talking about that a little bit, and then we drilled down into the specifics of facial research. But I want to go back to a general question, which is quite relevant to our department. So you may have noticed that there's a minor divide in PBS between behavioral science and social psychology. It's just a little divide. I'm going to get you into trouble now. So social psychology, it was originally a social psychology department, right? And it still predominantly is social psychologists. That's much more qualitative. It's more focused on, or it's amenable to open to qualitative methods, I should say, focused on social context. I think, I think social psychology in broad brushes, I would say it's probably a bit more amenable to decolonization, at least in principle. And then there's behavioral science, which is a bit more recent. It comes from economics. That's how I sort of arrived in the department. It's sort of economics / psychology. It's much more quantitative. And I think social psychologists tend to see behavioral science as a bit more narrow and maybe less relevant to big questions. For their part, behavioral scientists might tend to see social psychology is less rigorous, not good at identifying causal effects. So, I mean, how do you think how do you feel in your campaign? Have you brushed up against this divide? How do you feel the decolonization plays out between those two parts of the department?
Well, Miriam, first, do you want to say whether we are social psychologists?
I was going to say, actually, we're both cognitive psychologists.
Okay.
I think, sit in the middle of those two. I think that was a really nice kind of like conceptualizing the two camps. I don't want to say the word camps in our department because they're not. There's great collegiality, but I think you're right in like the perspectives and the approaches that social psychology takes versus kind of the behavioral science, behavioral economics. And maybe as cognitive psychologists, we sit in the middle and we can kind of appreciate both. Like we certainly, as we were saying earlier, appreciate the kind of, the experimental method that kind of aligns with that idea around being able to say something about a causal relationship, right? And that's what we do. I think we both come from experimental backgrounds of kind of running these experiments in the lab, controlling as many variables as we can, and being able to say something about causality in cognitive psychology about topics and ideas that come from the social psychology, right? So we try to take a slightly more rigorous causal methodology to look at those questions. I would say actually, but since taking up this work around decolonizing, I've certainly been open to the slightly more, qualitatively leaning methodologies from social psychology. Like my training is all quantitative, all experimental. I did my first qualitative piece of research for the decolonizing work when I joined this department. Otherwise, it was always experiments in labs. And actually you start to see how actually they can really complement each other, right? When you start to think about what can experiments bring, what can really kind of highly controlled experiments bring, but also what can come from the richness of qualitative and really drilling down into understanding the context a lot better.
Yeah, I really think it's about, ideally, really, they want you to be a mixed methods person, really. Yeah. They want someone who can be holistic in their approach and have both quantitative and qualitative training in them. And to be honest, for me, the projects that I enjoy the most are ones that are interdisciplinary and mixed methody, is that word even? These are the ones that I enjoy the most because these are the ones that I learn from them and kind of like expand my horizon and all of that stuff. But I do, as Miriam said, I do think that I don't think we are, maybe I will get myself in trouble here, but I don't think we are as that black and white anymore. I don't think that is the case. I think there's a lot of people who even approach social psychology from a quantitative level. Like, as I said, in the beginning, I would say I am a social cognitive scientist by heart. That would be, or by training, I don't know, by heart. Where I do try to look at social issues from quantitative point of view. So I think naively, I also at the beginning, I would have thought, let me rephrase this. I would have also kind of questioned the qualitative part of research and how rigorous it is, etc. But actually, there are so many variables that you can control in a study, and there's so many things that you can look into in one experiment. While actually, when you talk to people, that's when you gather an idea about everything, I think. So really, ideally, you'll have to be a mixed method person. And yeah.
I would also say, though, that in that differentiation of kind of the behavioral economics or behavioral science and social psychology, I think that kind of framing was around like the idea that kind of behavioral economics idea is the kind of colder, scientific, rigorous approach, and social psychology is the softer, really concerned with context and environment and people's more lived experience. even if you take that characterization, I don't think either of those disciplines then get to absolve themselves from colonial roots. I think, that kind of harder behavioral economics idea might say, okay, well, that's upholding this very colonial idea of kind of a Western knowledge base and a Western knowledge production. But social psychology, cognitive psychology, fully as sciences have their roots clearly in colonial ideas, right? Social psychology has really strong relationships to, oppression, segregation, harm, all of these ideas are looked at in social psychology, and social psychology was supposed to come and, help understand some of these things so we can actually reduce them, but we don't see that. We actually also see that they can be exploited to uphold a lot of those systems and structures as well. So I don't think, yes, we might have that characterization from a methodological and that distinction from a methodological perspective, but ultimately I think both of those have their roots in colonialism, and both of them need to engage with a decolonial process, really, otherwise you do those disciplines a disservice if you don't.
Yeah, and I also think there is like a divide. It's always interesting to see like in the room who explains behavior or who studies behavior explanation and who studies behavior change as well. And it's also important to see, well, what kind of methodology is being used in both, really, because like I am not a behavior economist in any way, so I'm not really an expert in the field. Also, it's just shallow reading, but any kind of change, behavior change policies that can, so not just testing why behavior the way it is, but also trying to change behavior can be extremely not suitable for different contexts. And
you could have a whole conversation around nudge. You could do a whole episode on
and that's
right, and the kind of libertarian paternalistic argument and how that fits within decolonizing and those ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a whole conversation of its own. So it's not just about decolonizing methodology of explaining behavior, but also decolonizing methodology of changing behavior. And I'm not aware of how advanced they are in this field. I tend to think that still as disadvanced as we are
and we're not advanced.
And we are not advanced. So I think both have a lot of work to do still.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that strikes me when I read economics research is that they still like just it sounds like a minor thing, but they just use terms like blacks and whites, and I'm just like, oh, for God's sake, can you like get up to date on like what race means? Like, and is it blacks, whites, and other? Of course, like it's just ridiculous, and there's absolutely no awareness. But I mean, you're right, Miriam. Right, that doesn't absolve the more woke disciplines, I guess, that you would like. Social psychology. I mean, anthropology. Anthropology is arguably the furthest ahead with this type of stuff, right? But there's this joke about anthropologists that it's like, well, they may hate colonialism, but without it they wouldn't have jobs, because
that's it. So the whole discipline actually came from going to these places, and it was kind of literally part of imperialist expansion, right? Was to go and study these indigenous people and really understand who they are. Like there's some enigma to be observed.
Yeah, sort of prodding them, like that kind of like outside, almost like you're going to a zoo or something. That really weird. Yeah. And that anthropology, I think, has been racked by colonial guilt for probably most of its existence, right? Because of that, for that reason.
Because of that. But I think that's it, and that goes to the question of, or to the point of methodologies where they have that space to be able to then widen it out and actually be able to face up to that colonial guilt, right? And actually think about how can we restructure our discipline, how can we rethink our discipline to kind of address those roots.
Yeah, and I also want to, you've briefly mentioned like how it's like white, black, and other. That's also another big discussion, right? Where like, as I said before, it's seen like white or Caucasian Western is the default, and then you have one another minority group, and then you kind of group everyone else as one group, which is totally, that is not scientifically accurate in any way. There's so many variability in them that we practice like a level of reductionism that is insane, in my opinion, where like you're grouping, like you can't even group Middle Easterns as one group because you can't compare a Moroccan.
I think we're a perfect example of that.
Yeah, exactly. You're like a Libyan woman or half Libyan
Right,
woman
yeah.
and a Palestinian woman. It's just they can be completely different. Even the language could be very different. So I think it reduces the science to a very shallow level of looking at things. And that's again where I say, well, that's why, because it just needs more than one person. It needs journals to be part of this. It needs editors to be a part of this. It needs funders to be part of this, where they are saying we are prioritizing these maybe projects that take longer or take more resources just to get the more truthful answer. And we also have students that, even students who are not going, okay, most of our students are not going into research, okay? So even if they are here, they might still deal with these issues. So they need to be also aware of it. They need to be aware of different, as we said, methodologies, different people and all of that. And so if we don't at least, bring it up, we're doing them a disservice as well. So you really can't ignore it. I don't think there's any psychology program that can now go on with ignoring these issues.
Yeah, I think we're really touching on something that's maybe a little bit more fundamental, right, than your participant characteristics or your your researcher characteristics, right? It's like about how we actually do research and how we teach. And I suppose one thing that kind of came through, when I've thought about this before and when I was reading some of the stuff you sent me, is there's this kind of researcher or teacher as an outsider idea, right? They come in, they perform an experiment on the subjects they sort of leave with the knowledge, and you use the terminology extract knowledge, right, Miriam, right? And this is also related to what you were saying about Jordan, right, Deema, and your research there. So it just seems to me that, is it fundamentally, do we have to like reconceive of research and teaching as kind of more contextual and collaborative, and people say co-produced, right, when the sort of the student and the teacher are working together to produce knowledge, or the participant and the experimenter? I mean, do you think that that's really has to be an intrinsic part of this decolonization process?
I think so, because when I first started in research, I was slightly naive, where I was like, I'm going to be a researcher, but I'm going to be a researcher who can research anything. Okay. I don't want to kind of like corner myself where I'm like, I'm just going to do something to do with minorities, because I thought that kind of like, oh, okay, if you're a minority person, then you do research on the minority that you come from. Initially, I thought that's kind of, I was cornering myself, or I thought it gives the assumption that that's all I can do, right? And that's why I was like, no, I'm going to do something that everyone can do. Or by everyone, I mean that Caucasian researchers do as well. But once I became more aware of the knowledge that we have, and more aware of the limitations of the knowledge that we have, so this is where my personality as Deema and who I am as a person interplays with who I am as a researcher, where I'm like, no, hold on. Yes, you are trained in these methods and these frames of work now, But you know, based on who you are as a person, that we are missing these things. So that's where I'm now, like, I'm actually allowing myself to go into these places where I thought were kind of pigeonholing myself earlier on. So yeah, I do think that there is a big part of, but that's where it takes, the whole mixed methodology thing, because if you don't, like, you can take, actually, let me just take a step backwards. You take these like demographic information about the participants before they do a usual experiment, so like their age, their gender. Maybe now people ask about race as well, but that's all you take from them in terms of who they are, right? Is the majority of it. You don't, if you are just doing a quantitative study on them. So that is where the whole holistic approach takes into account that you can then learn from them and try to apply it, maybe not in this experiment, but in the experiment after it. But how really that is applied, I don't know how good it's in terms of application.
I think that
sorry, go ahead, Miriam.
Oh, no, just to say, like, the point you said, Kahal, around the co-creation or collaboration in teaching and in research, I think that's really critical. So I actually think it's that co-creation that allows us to identify the gaps in our knowledge, in our discipline, right? And actually that often comes from those marginalized groups themselves feeling like they aren't being represented. So like as an example, so I'm half British, half Libyan, and I kind of noticed that, okay, most certainly my British identity is very clearly represented in knowledge production. The epistemic landscape is very much is there. But actually, I don't feel that the kind of Libyan side, I don't really know about knowledge production, how they think about these things. And I actually hadn't paid it much attention because I had been, trained in kind of UK institutions. It was only when COVID happened that you got this, I think COVID's a really good example, right? It was presented as this is this great existential crisis for the planet, right? The global population is dealing with this. This is the biggest issue that we're facing. And then at the same time, in Libya, there was a civil war. And actually, that was just anecdotally for me. I was like, well, and I looked at some of the kind of global research that was coming out on that, and Libya's never included in that research, right? It's not a very accessible country. Researchers can't go in there.
Just coded as missing.
Yeah,
right,
always just coded as missing. I think it's like in the world value survey for the last couple of waves, but like, that's it really. But otherwise it's really not represented. But Egypt might get represented or Morocco might get represented and they say, okay, this is just the North African like perspective. But actually the Libya context was really specific because it was a very particular civil war in a particular region of the country. So I did a whole research project looking at that, and you actually find that they didn't care about COVID at all, right? That's there's a kind of discounting of COVID because actually my immediate risk is war that's happening, and I need to be able to deal with that. I don't have the infrastructure. They don't have online supermarket deliveries. I'm not going to be using that as a service. I have to go to the shop and try and get stuff. But that piece of work I actually co-created. I had an initial idea and I took it to, we had like a working group. Kat, maybe you remember we had a working group at the time that Yet set up that was around kind of research on COVID. And I kind of had this idea of why is this conversation happening that COVID is the biggest crisis for absolutely everyone? And that's not what I'm seeing when I look to Libya, for example. And so I actually got to work with a few people. I kind of had this initial idea, I got feedback, and I developed this survey and, kind of put that together and find that, no, actually, in other contexts, COVID wasn't the biggest crisis that was happening. And that has huge ramifications. But without that kind of, I would say lived experience, I wasn't there, but without that kind of that knowledge, without having family there, without that being part of my identity, there would be no representation of that. So that kind of co-creation comes from creating space for people from these more marginalized backgrounds to say, do you know what, I'm not being represented, but actually there is a huge contribution to the knowledge base to be made here if you allow the space for it. So yeah, just say that I think that collaborative idea is kind of really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I was going to ask you too about your backgrounds, as Deema being a Palestinian woman and Miriam being Libyan. But I mean, what I'm kind of hearing here is from both of you, it wasn't so much that you came in to research being like, oh, I'm from this background and I'm going to make sure that that's heard. It was almost like the opposite, actually. You came in and you sort of did the quote unquote normal thing, the weird thing, right? For a while until eventually you just couldn't ignore the biases and the problems with this way of doing things.
Yeah, for me personally, obviously representation matters. Okay, it matters a lot. But for me, even that wasn't the thing that kind of it triggered this whole thing in me. It was more about like, this is not good enough research. Like we're doing, at least in my field, we're doing something wrong here and we're doing something fundamentally wrong. So how can I just keep, specifically because my initial research started on group perception. So how do you perceive a crowd? How do you perceive a group? How do you perceive, who is threatening in a group, or how threatening is a group is? And like, I just kept coming to problems with studying these things just because of the methodology that was available for me. And so I came to a point where I'm like, I just can't ignore this anymore, because I'm just gonna keep making research that is just not as impactful as it should be if it's done correctly, taking into account all these contexts. And I didn't want to be another researcher who disqualifies non-Caucasian participants, to have no other race confounding variables. So that was my initial change, let's say. But also, obviously, you develop as a researcher, and the way you think develops, and you start learning what is emphasized, what's not emphasized. And to go back to your question before, we don't just teach Caucasian students, we teach students from all over the world. So we also want to give them knowledge that is also relevant to them, knowledge that is also, they can see in their real life and they can apply to their real life. And so if I'm teaching, I teach social neuroscience or biological psychology. If I'm talking to them about, like, for example, we have what's called like skin conductance analysis or something like that. And we look at how different biological processes are correlated with different social and cognitive processes. And you have to tell your students that some of these methodologies are not actually, they don't work the same for everyone. Or I have a student who looked into how people read. He used what is called facial reading methodology, where the participant sits in front of the laptop and either watches the video or does kind of interact with some kind of stimuli. And this methodology it has to let me go back a little bit. It kind of categorizes the participants' emotional expressions based on what they are watching, right? But what he had a problem with is that it categorizes Caucasian participants' emotional expressions well, okay? So he can see how they are reacting to the stimuli, but it doesn't categorize East Asian participants' emotions. Right? So it's just about like giving the students as well knowledge that they can also take with them and apply in their own homes as well. So for me, it's for me more about what was interesting for me, what I thought is good science and not good science, but also I wanted all the students to have the opportunity to interact with the knowledge that they have.
Yeah. I suppose one question which leads on to this. So you've got this, the different levels of decolonization, let's say, to simplify. So you've got this sort of the representation aspect, and then you've got like changing your practices, like you just discussed, right? And doing research and teaching differently, and making sure that people are included, not just there, but actually participating, having things that are relevant to them. But I mean, then you've got this kind of more radical notion, I suppose, and Miriam, some of your materials touched on this, is like, is it really about rethinking universities and education at a more fundamental level? And like, what, I'm not asking for a blueprint, but like, what might that look like?
I think it is, and I think that's the part that discomforts people. Partly because the idea of it is huge, right? The idea that we would have to restructure universities. How do you even go about that? I mean, if I take again this that we talked about at the beginning, this very small step that we created a course that centers marginalized voices, the work that went into that as like a first step. I mean, maybe it speaks to academia, right? That we're really good at playing lip service and kind of rhetorical support for ideas, and we will labor a conversation for a very long time, right? Around, if we're going to do it, we have to do it right. But what does right look like? And then there'll be an entire discussion around that. And then, years go by and we've made no tangible progress, but we are talking about it. And that's the main thing. I think that's really like, I think a structure in universities, in academia.
Or we get stuck on semantics as well.
We get stuck on semantics, right? Making sure we're using the right word. And like, not to say that that's not important. I think that is important. It is important to make sure we're using the right words for things. But often we can get stuck on those semantics at the expense of making any such progress. And we might get it wrong. I think it's also important to say that we might take a step and it might be wrong, but we need to be able to have systems and structures that hold us accountable and say, okay, this isn't working. I think the process of being able to decolonize universities requires a lot of kind of iterative reflections, right? We say we're trying this, like we're going to trial this course and see, is this enough? Is the department happy with this? Are students happy with this? What do they like? What do they not like? Then we go back to the drawing board, but at least we're doing something. And I think if we then think on a larger scale, this kind of decolonizing universities is the same thing, right? What can we start with? Maybe one thing we can start with is that promotions don't need to be contingent on publishing in these particular journals, right? We have this journal list, and you've got to get within these, particular journals in order to get promotion. But those journals themselves uphold this kind of colonial ideas of there is a particular intellectual landscape that we deem appropriate for you to demonstrate that you are advanced enough to get that promotion. Can we say, let's not do that, and actually let's open up the journal list and really look at journals from the global south, or look just far more broadly and say, actually, let's measure quality research using a different metric other than journal impact factors, right? And can we just trial it? And if it doesn't work, for whatever reason, it work. But I think it does need to be that radical transition, that radical change at the university level. I think there's fear associated with doing decolonizing wrong. Like we might take one step and it might be the wrong one. People are going to be really unhappy, and then we have to kind of go back. But actually, people aren't happy with the structures at the moment, right? They're not they're serving a small proportion of society. But we're kind of okay with them being happy. We're not okay with that particular group of people being discomforted. If we were to try one small, initiative to start decolonizing, if they're made to feel uncomfortable, we might backtrack slightly. But at the moment, the conditions are there are a lot of people who are uncomfortable and discomforted by the systems that we have. So yeah, I think that kind of accountability and that fear of taking a wrong step is preventing this more radical change at the university level.
This isn't just you angling for a promotion, is it? It's like with the
I'm like lower the expectation.
Yeah. It's like when I don't get promoted, it's like,
yeah,
well, we need to
exactly.
rethink the whole journal system, you know.
This isn't working for us. Let's just lower the
Yeah.
expectations.
No, I mean, I completely agree, and I think there's obviously a status quo bias here, right? It's like, because if a misstep is taken, then that's taken to be evidence that, you know, the whole decolonization project is a bust. So let's go back to what it was like before. But obviously that's failing in obvious ways that we've been discussing.
Yeah, and I also think there's also an issue of like, are we trying to decolonize or decrease a subset voices, or are we trying to amplify some marginalized voices? So I don't think we're trying to quiet anyone down. We're just trying to amplify other voices. So I think that's also a distinction that is important to make. We're not trying to make as any group less than. We're just trying to amplify some of the voices that are underrepresented and that we can't really ignore anymore. And I think that would be interesting to see how students engage with this. Who are the students that engage with this? It doesn't matter, like, as long as students engage with this, it doesn't matter if they are, you know, the targeted ones or not or whatever. But it's interesting to see who is interested in this.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also interesting to see that actually a lot of this work has buy-in from students, from junior faculty, right, who are, you know, a lot from marginalized backgrounds on precarious contracts, right? You've already got buy-in from those people. Where you maybe don't have as much buy-in is from higher up in the hierarchy, right?
I will also
that.
Yeah, I think we didn't really touch upon this. In terms of marginalized voices, it's not just on race and nationalities and where it comes from globally as well. We have people that will be discussing like gender issues. We're going to be talking about LGBTQ issues. We're going to talk like any kind of marginalized voice that is not really seen as a whole in the field. So it's not just a racialized issue. It's just I mean, maybe Miriam, you can talk about some of the topics, but it's not just about, you know, global South versus, the Western globe.
Yeah, I think that's probably speaking a bit more kind of on the department level. And actually, I mean, I wonder if it was slightly easier on a department level, not to say it was easy, it wasn't easy, but maybe easier because the department is that kind of smaller. You can have a safer space, a more principled space to have maybe a more uncomfortable conversation. People know each other a little bit more, right? You feel that you can maybe say something that might be wrong, but it's okay because, you know, there's not going to be a significant backlash, right? But as soon as you get into the bigger spaces, like at the university level, where you're dealing with, you know, the more unknown, you don't know people as well, it's maybe a less safe space, then that's where the conversation becomes challenging. But like on the department level, I think just to emphasize Deema's point that it's not about saying, you know, we no longer want to hear from white people. Absolutely not. It's not even, you know, based on race. Actually, there's huge contributions that come like from, you know, the white canons, for example. This is not to say we don't want to hear from those anymore. We absolutely want to hear from those, but it's about actually opening it up and saying, well, let's think about all these other intersecting dimensions, demographic dimensions, right? Let's think about race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and like all of these ideas and, you know, kind of re-center. So it's not one particular demographic that is the center of the conversation, right? So if you think about like psychology, you know, is kind of predominantly built on this assumption that the kind of universal subject, the universal person is this very egocentric, individualistic kind of, you know, disconnected from their community kind of person, right? And we're actually just saying that's not everyone. Across all of these different intersecting demographics, that's not the only human experience. Let's open it up and see, you know, what other experiences are.
You're kind of implicitly responding to the Nick Gibbs comments in 2021 there, I think. It feels like, where he said, what did he say? Yeah, there is no reason why the work of a dead white man is not appropriate for children from ethnic minorities to know about, and we shouldn't be ashamed of who we are and where we came from. But yeah.
Yeah, I actually used that quote in my first ever piece of qualitative research with students, which was to get an understanding from students of what do you think decolonizing actually is, and I used that as a prompt. And really interesting insights from students from more marginalized backgrounds to say, okay, yeah, great, the white canon is really useful. The dead white man has got some interesting things to say, but what about the people? What about my background? What do people who look like me or sound like me? What do they have to say about this too?
Yeah, I don't see it as limiting the scope of the knowledge.
No,
I actually think of just expanding it a little bit more, which seems like so obvious. Obviously, it seems like
it seems obvious,
but it's
I think just discomfort comes from the idea of people worried that am I part of this group that's got this who's benefiting from a power structure, and what does that mean? But it's not about individuals. It's never about individuals. It's kind of about broader systems that advantage groups.
Well, look, I mean, as a former vegan, I know all about this, but no, I mean, veganism is actually is a very good example of what I sort of found out what happens when people feel uncomfortable with your presence, because it raises the question, and I'm not saying vegans are right, but it raises the question, what if everything I'm doing is like wrong, right? And that's clearly what Nick Gibbs is experiencing. It's the cognitive dissonance or whatever. And that's when you get these defense mechanisms kicking in, right? And that's how you just get this kind of resistance, which isn't usually particularly thoughtful, but it's something that we've got to reckon with.
Yeah. And actually, when you have a conversation, I think people then realize that actually, it was just a kind of cognitive dissonance actually, and they can kind of then reconcile that, and I think that's how we make progress with these things.
I think we've been chatting for an hour and a half. It's been really interesting. I do want to raise one question which kind of gets to what you were talking about. Now you mentioned we've talked a bit about tokenism, right? And you mentioned different dimensions, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on. Now, you didn't mention class, which isn't to say that you're not considering it. You probably would have if you'd listed more things. But there's this. I had this experience, right? So there's this scholar called Ibn Khaldun, who you probably know, right? It's the sort of 14th century Arabic scholar. And a few years back, it was coming out. I think it was becoming popularized that he kind of predated Adam Smith. Adam Smith's famous insights about the division of labor, the pin factory, and so on in the 18th century, sorry. And Khaldun said it all in the 14th century. And I remember reading that and being like, oh great, I'll include Khaldun in my work. Isn't that great to have this Arabic scholar from so long ago that I'm doing a decolonization. Now then I actually read the Muqaddimah, his magnum opus, and there are a couple of things that struck me about it. One, it is like not a great book. It's just basically illegible. I don't know if either of you two have read it.
I haven't read it, but I knew where you were going.
You have read it. Okay. Well, maybe you can. I mean, look, it's a different cultural context, but I didn't get that much out of it. And the cool bits that anticipated Adam Smith are kind of cherry picked out of quite a lot. And I also read the abridged version. The unabridged version's like 1,500 pages long. But also, it was, despite the fact that he's an Arabic scholar, it didn't feel like he was in the spirit of decolonization, Khaldun. Let me put it that way. Obviously, anybody who writes a book like that in 14th century Islamic empires is not like... I keep falling back on this term, woke, right? The things he says about women, I mean, he barely considers women people, right? I think he compares them to animals, and there's all this about the savages, other people, you know what I mean? And I was kind of thinking, what use is it including this bloke? Because he's not in the spirit of decolonization at all. And then it made me think, and sorry, I'm going on for quite a long time with this, but it just made me think about the class structure of universities now, right? And it's like he's the rich white dude of his civilization, and there's this issue in the modern day with, we were talking about RCDs. I mean, you've got Banerjee, who's like the main guy who won the economics Nobel Prize. He's Indian, right? But he does the same thing we were talking about, the kind of RCT colonial enterprise. And I think there's this real issue with class and a kind of, and actually it's interesting because your thing you sent me, your teaching materials, Miriam, they did contain a critique of multiculturalism from this angle. So this is a very general, vague sort of ramble, but I'm just wondering how you think all of these class issues and the sort of global elite who may be like Ibn Khaldun, they may be from another race, but they're not really in the spirit of decolonization. I mean, how does this factor in?
So maybe I'll briefly talk about it. First of all, so yeah, when we talk about the weird issue as well, I think we have, I don't know if you've met Jeremy Gings, but he's a new professor in our department, and he also wrote about, you know, what happened after the first initial weird critique, and how people never ever report the education or the socioeconomic background of the participants as well, and how that can also relate to the conclusions that we get from these experiments. But also, even so, like if I'm talking about myself, okay, I'm someone who I did my undergrad here, my master's and my PhD all on scholarships, really. Like I wouldn't have been able to afford it, but my dad has a PhD as well. My mom is also educated, right? So I still come from this privileged background where I have this kind of really bubble of academia that I live in, where actually I do feel guilty sometimes, because I do feel like I am over intellectualizing the issues that we deal with, and that I'm slightly far from the people on the ground and what they have to deal with. And so yeah, I personally, I carry that kind of guilt with me, even though I'm not actually privileged. If you think about like in terms of class, I don't, you know, I'm a very junior academic, so I don't make much money anyway. And I studied here on scholarships, and even then, I still consider myself to be more privileged than the average Palestinian. And that kind of, it's kind of like, you know, a noise in the back of my mind when I am trying to conduct this research, where I have to think like, oh, am I overstepping here a little bit, or am I not? But that might be because I am also a woman, and I am also, you know, we know that junior women academics tend to be slightly way more critical of themselves as compared to other academics. So that might be playing part in it, and imposter syndrome and all of these things. So yes, I mean, ideally you would take all of these privileges into account. Then but I don't know how much it really, like, I mean, even if you take like any economist, what's his name? Behavior economist, like anyone, like you don't see what they think about. I mean, you talked about Khaldun, Ibn Khaldun. He's actually very famous in the report, and he's one of actually one of my school in hometown is called Ibn Khaldun.
Oh, right.
After him. Yeah. So we kind of call each school after one of, you know, scientists or whatever. So he is renowned for that scientific part of it, but not so much his personal opinions and his class. But even like some people have to say that about like Edward Said or anyone like Rushdie, you know, like at some point there becomes this kind of distance, I feel, between the academic once they reach the academia and the people they represent.
I think I mean, I think your first point, Deema, actually speaks to issues around positionality, which I think are really interesting. I could talk loads about those as being a clearly very white passing person with a very British accent, right?
Well, you have, not me.
Yeah, no. So for me, right, and the kind of privilege all of that affords me, right? In comparison, you've got the kind of hierarchies of privilege relating to class and all of these sorts of things, and what that means for positionality as researchers. But also, I think the second point to that, actually, I think a lot of the criticism directed towards decolonizing is this idea of it's kind of very anti-white, right? It's kind of this like takedown of white people finally, and the idea that people from other backgrounds are somehow kind of, you know, bastions of morality and they uphold ideas of equity and social justice, and they don't. You know, the same biases around and the same ideas of kind of power structures, the ideas around racism, of class issues are happening in all of those other cultures as well, right? The decolonizing push, the decolonizing movement isn't saying it's time to take down white people because they are bad and they have been pushing down everyone else in you know, the global south, or however we want to conceptualize that. It's not saying that, because everyone, all cultures will have these biases. People will have their the kind of, you know, their own positioning. I think you know, that kind of this idea of some people will hold one view on something, kind of social justice for these people, but not for these people, right? I mean, you see it on like, you know, I'll support these people in getting kind of liberation, whatever, but actually I maintain that there is no oppression against those people, right? People don't hold these consistent worldviews, right? And it's not the idea that decolonialism is kind of an anti-white movement and everyone else is just and moral and ethical. I think not at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you maybe it's worth sort of emphasizing that, and you can reach some people. I don't know if Nick Gibbs someone we can or want to reach, but maybe some people who you know, might agree with his point a little bit. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally it does, you know, the university is not really a place for working class people from anywhere. You just, I mean, in the department we have 2 working class guys, I think, which is quite a lot. At Manchester in the economics department, I mean, I didn't interview everybody about their background, right? But I don't really think we had anybody that was working class, and I just don't think that's a place or a path that people go. And it comes back to this idea of like abolishing the university, right?
Yeah, universities are very middle class, right? Even in their so I was reading, you know, some work before, because I was looking at things like attainment gaps, for example, right? And things like these class issues really play into attainment gaps, and things like even the university admission process, right? When you write a personal statement to get into university, it's a really individualistic approach, right? It's how am I really great, right? Me as a person. But actually, and there's a lot of kind of social neuroscience research on this as well, right? That actually shows that people from working class backgrounds are not individualistic. Actually, they take a very collectivist mindset, right? So getting into that idea of how do I celebrate me and acknowledge me as an individual and how good I am to get into university. So if they then get over that hurdle and get into, you know, whichever university they've applied for, they're then in a system that really celebrates and acknowledges and rewards individualism, right? And I think you then start to get like an isolation. I think, yeah, this kind of class idea is in universities is another aspect that leads into how university systems and structures don't serve a lot of people in them.
But also, I think now people are starting to think of how useful is, you know, as a university degree based on, you know, the jobs that are available, based on the fees that they have to pay. And that's why, like, one of the reasons that for me personally, I want to make sure that the knowledge that I'm giving the students is at least relevant to their life. And it's not just, you know, we're not just sitting around talking about theories and not, you know.
Do that a lot, but
we do that a lot. But I think
too much.
I think we have moved, not just us. I think just maybe I'm just naive, but I feel like everyone is slightly moving kind of towards a more realistic view of the student. But yeah, I don't know if you can say we have like 2 working class people or not. As I said, I think it becomes slightly more nuanced than that. Like, as I said, like, even if you look at me, like, as I said, I studied here on a scholarship, but my dad has a PhD, but he's still like a teacher. So that's, you know, that is kind of working class, but there's a status in it as well. So it's kind of like, it's really complicated in that sense.
I guess it speaks to how status changes as you move, right?
Yeah.
Like Yeah.
Exactly. So for like, if I go back home, I'm considered very privileged in a sense, really. And maybe some of my ideas are actually rejected from the start because of might be misunderstood as like brainwashed, something like that. While here, maybe I am not so privileged here. So like it just really it does depend on the
Yeah.
context that you are
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to end. But I think we've we've touched on quite a lot of different topics, and we've got into the much more fundamental critique. And I suppose the conclusion is just abolish universities, right? Can I have you on record as agreeing?
I'm starting an assistant prof on August 1st. I can't start on this line.
Not so much abolish, I guess more kind of like knock down and rebuild.
I think just expand, really.
Yeah.
I think that is
that kind of expansion idea.
Expand, really, where I don't think at least people in vision scientists, they like to say giants built this field. So we built this on giants. We're not trying to, abolish these giants. We're just trying to expand it. That's
intellectually expanding.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think maybe universities can be more situated in the communities they're in as well, and just things like that make them more accessible and less of a gargantuan sort of alien institution, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Miriam and Deema, thanks so much for joining me. It's been really enjoyable.
Thank you so much.